to share the screen?
Yeah, you can just do the sharing.
Yeah, thanks, Fred, and also Bill and Jamie for doing this today. In trying to answer the question, what was Klaus's greatest contributions? This was difficult for me. I decided maybe, for me anyway, his greatest contribution was what he did for me. And so I thought I'd talk a little about some of that, reflecting on it. I'll just say, Klaus, he would get frustrated with me, and I don't know if that'll come through here or not. This phrase that Fred referred to, I'm not so sure. I heard that many times, and it's roughly translated. I'm not so sure as could be said. Hell no, but he was much more polite about it. The first intersection between Klaus and myself is associated with Ross Ashby. I was an undergraduate student in electrical engineering, and one of the courses that we took, it was a required course, was called Elements of Communication. And the required textbook for the course was Ross Ashby's An Introduction to Cybernetics. It was my favorite course, my favorite instructor, and I liked the book, and I thought it was fun, and that stuck in my mind. Later, when I was searching for a doctoral program, one of the aspects of such programs that I was really trying to find was if there were some courses in cybernetics that I could take. And I actually found some courses at the University of Pennsylvania, two of which were taught by Klaus. Klaus himself had been a student of Ross Ashby. He knew the name. He had studied at the Ulm School of Design with Horst Riddle, and Riddle used Ashby's ideas a lot. Klaus got a Fulbright scholarship to the United States, and eventually at some point was able to navigate over to the University of Illinois. Ross Ashby had happened to come there recently, and the two-course sequence that Ashby taught at Illinois was what convinced Klaus to go there and to major in communication. So that's how I ended up at the University of Pennsylvania, not to study communication studies. That wasn't my background. My field was operations research. But these two courses, Models of Communication and Communication Society, I ended up taking. I first met Klaus in the fall of 1974. All I knew about these courses were what was stated in the catalog. And so I went to him and I said, can I take cybernetics and society in the second semester that I was there? I know first semester was already gone. And he said, well, I'm not so sure. I think maybe you ought to take the first course first. So I waited till the following fall and took the two courses in sequence. Among the aspects of Ashby that influenced me that I learned from Klaus had to do with this one paper by Ashby called Constraint Analysis of Many-Dimensional Relations. My dissertation ended up being called Constraint Theory. And just the short version is, in operations research in general, decision models treat desires as goals or objectives. You formulate them as goals or objectives. And Klaus, said, well, maybe you ought to think about these as constraints. And so that gave me a topic, gave me something new. It was a little bit foreign to operations research. There was something called goal programming there that was close, but not the same. But in any case, this was obviously a huge influence on me. It led me to the topic of beyond planning, a paper I wrote in his class and later delivered at a conference. Also there, and also of influence in me selecting the University of Pennsylvania, was Russell Ackoff, who you may know. Ackoff had created the operations research program at Penn and had written, I think, the first, or certainly one of the first textbooks on operations research with Wes Churchman and Igor Ansoff. And so I arrive at the University of Pennsylvania only to discover that Akoff had created a new program called Social System Science. It was no longer really associated with the Operations Research Program. Fred Steyer actually was in the Social System Science program, but the Operations Research just fit my background more from engineering and management. So I stuck with that. Akoff and Emery, Fred Emery, wrote a book called On Purposeful Systems. The subject of purpose came up often in Klaus's courses, and something that not only did I struggle with at the time, but I continued to do so. There were some overlaps between Akoff and Krippendorff, but it was, I mean, the tension was obvious. The social system science program was an interdisciplinary program, and so it drew on faculty from around the university, and Klaus was one of the faculty in the social system science program created by Akoff. But one of the overlaps, I think, was that Akoff would talk about the false dichotomy between ends and means. That really these merge, and when they merge, the idea of purpose begins to change. Klaus wanted him to go even further with it than that, but you know, it's one of the things I was able to grapple with, and in fact, the tension between them, I now look back on as something to my advantage. I was able to see two sides and really play with that and generate some ideas of my own. Akoff's approach was interactive planning. I won't go into that, in a process called idealization. So he moved from goals and objectives to ideals, but still not the same as desires as a set of constraints. As a set of constraints, desires become resources in the decision process. One other connection there was Stafford Beer, where many of us are familiar with, very close friends with Akoff, although they disagreed on a number of things. Akoff would invite Beer over to the university. I was there at one of the sessions in which they talked and argued, but always in a friendly way. And Akoff would talk about a difference being that in organizations, the elements, as opposed to living systems, biological systems, that the elements are themselves have their own purposes. In a living system, a biological system, the components, the parts do not have their own purposes. Another intersection was Gregory Bateson, which Klaus would use often in his courses. And the idea of restraints is very similar to the idea of constraint, very associated with information theory, which in the first course, we, the students, got a whuge helping of information theory, solving all kinds of little exercises that he and Ashby also had drummed up to talk about it. And Bateson also drew on this idea of information, but in a little different way. Bateson also would talk about epistemology, not in the way I had learned it as a branch of philosophy, but he'd use the word to talk about something that every individual, every human actually has. Everyone has, he would say, an epistemology. And cultures also carry certain epistemologies. These are ways of thinking, ways of knowing, ways of dealing with the world. Even Bateson would even say, and I think Klaus liked this, that everyone has an epistemology. Those that think they don't just have a bad one. So that was eye-opening. Bateson also dealt with the topic of purpose, the effects of conscious purpose on human adaptation, one of his most famous papers, and in a topic for a conference that Mary Catherine Bateson reported on. Gregory Bateson had organized the conference. She reported on it in our own metaphor. Gregory Bateson, visited the University of Pennsylvania at the invitation of Klaus. I was there at the time and attended at least a couple of the sessions that he held. I'll just relate one story. Klaus had pushed me. He wanted a small group of his students to meet with Gregory Bateson separately. And we did, and he would push me to ask a certain type of question. And the question he wanted me to ask was about the topic of planning. So I asked the question of Gregory. I read some of your work, and you seem to be against planning in general, in the usual sense of the word. And he said, "Well, I'm wondering why that is." And Bateson said, "I can walk down the street right now. Someone can come up, take out a gun, shoot me in the head. So much for planning." That was his response to my question. I had to think. I didn't have a chance to follow up because there are others that wanted to ask their questions, and it sort of left it. But I thought it was a very interesting response and something I've thought about ever since. For here and for this presentation, I'll just leave that. But it was something that also resonated with Klaus and something he pushed me to continue to look into. There was also the subject of ways of thinking. Gregory Bateson would talk about the difference between Occidental and Oriental ways of thinking. He really criticized the Occidental, what he called the Occidental way of thinking, and that needed to change drastically. Klaus also had this interest in East versus West. He wrote a paper, which is not easy to find, but it had to do with, I don't have the title right handy, but had to do with Eastern and Western cybernetics and how they are quite different from each other. Very nice paper that I would recommend. And of course, Klaus ended up being Gregory Bateson Professor of Cybernetics, Culture, and Language at the Annenberg School of Communication, University of Pennsylvania. Another intersection had to do with organizations. I arrived at the University of Pennsylvania in the fall of 1974. I didn't know anything about it, about American Society for Cybernetics, but they were holding their annual conference right there at the University of Pennsylvania. Klaus was the organizer for it. I was in a course with Russell Ackoff, and during the time that this conference was going on, Ackoff actually announced this conference being held right at the campus and suggested to this class of 100 students that maybe they would benefit by going over and seeing what it's all about. I had other things to do, and I didn't do that. But it was interesting from a historical point of view because this was the last conference of the American Society for Cybernetics until 1981. There was some tension between Klaus in particular, but also some others, and the executive of the ASC, to the point where Klaus and a couple of others went off and created their own organization called the American Cybernetics Association. In the meantime, others, particularly Heinz von Forster, began attending, or they'd been attending before, but treating the Society for General Systems Research as the place where they could deliver their papers and meet once a year. That Society for General Systems Research became the International Society for the Systems Sciences. Interestingly, something that Russell Ackoff, when he became president of SGSR Institute, he changed the title of that organization. But during this period of time, these 7 years, ASC and ACA talked. Barry Clemson was involved from the ASC point of view. Stuart Umpleby certainly wanted to get it together. And so eventually they merged using the bylaws of the ACA, but keeping the name ASC in its corporate standing. So the first ASC conference in 7 years was 1981, and Stuart asked, he was president now of ASC, asked if I would organize the program for that conference. I want to mention one other conference briefly because it was both seminal in my formation, and because Klaus was very much involved in my attendance and participation in this conference. I'd written this paper that I mentioned called Beyond Planning for Klaus in one of his courses. Klaus called Stuart Umpleby, who was organizing some sessions at this SGSR meeting, and suggested that maybe he include me in my paper in the sessions, one of the sessions. Stuart called me and we talked, and that's what I ended up doing. So I ended up in Denver in 1977, where the AAAS, American Association for the Advancement of Science, was also meeting. At that conference, this is when Francisco Varela presented his A Calculus for Self-Reference. And Heinz von Forster, who was just stepping down as president of ASGSR, organized a panel. And I thought I'd list the panelists so that if you have any interest, you could just write them down. But this is Margaret Mead, James Greer Miller, Francisco Varela, Joseph Goguen, Ernst von Glasisfeld, and Kenneth Bowling. Now, I was new. This is my first academic conference that I'd ever participated in it to an extent. And as far as I knew, this was just normal. It's only in of course, in reflection that I see that this was very much not, a normal event at a cybernetics or systems conference. Right after that panel, I sat with Klaus at every one of these events, except when I was delivering my own paper. But after the panel, a few of us went out to lunch, and Ernst von Glasisfeld was there, and there were some others. And I got this chance to talk more informally with people, and I was pretty much at that point sold. A few highlights since 1981. In the time period 83 to 84, I was 1 year in Philadelphia at the University of Pennsylvania. Fred was there. Stuart Umpleby was on a sabbatical. He was also in Philadelphia. And Klaus came up with the idea, let's meet about once a week and have some conversations. No agenda, just come and have conversations. Turns out that Klaus had built, he was a designer, and he'd built this thing called a conversation pit in his house. There's a fireplace, there are places to sit, there are places to lie down. I mean, you could, and just, but always in a place where everyone could see everyone else. And Klaus, Fred, Stuart, and also Ed Gravin, who Fred might remember, and occasionally there'd be a guest, and we couldn't all attend every week, but it was quite an occasion that lasted for a year. I think we went over to Fred's house a couple of times, but mostly it was at Klaus's conversation pit that we did this. Klaus developed an interest in what he would then call genuine conversation. And we would talk about society and organizations as networks of conversation. I'll leave that there. For those that know me, conversation is one of my things. It was not something that Klaus had a high interest on or talked about during the courses back in the 1970s, but certainly something that dominated his thinking until his death. The subject of thinking. This has been one of my preoccupations. And I had always would think about thinking as an individual thing, something that I do or that you do. And Klaus would keep pushing me to say, no, thinking is a social activity. It doesn't matter, and it doesn't matter if you're alone or not. When you think, you are doing something social. You're doing it in language, and you're bringing in all of those conversations that you've had up to that point. So it's both My thinking now is more that it's both individual and collective activity simultaneously. Language, also, as Fred said, a very important topic for Klaus. Here's a quote. Just a minute. I am convinced that most contemporary cyberneticians consider it plausible to put their humanity in what they are doing. The issue is to encourage awareness of what their language constructively facilitates or systematically inhibits. This is from a paper that he wrote. Not sure if it was his last paper or not, but the 2019, so it's certainly one of his last. And in here are a few quotes I'll just close with from that paper. I maintain that finding ourselves at the mercy of powerful computational technicities is nothing other than the result of having adopted a language that has no place for reflexivity in which human agency can be exercised. Quite a strong statement. Reflexive cybernetics. He would talk about the reflexive turn in cybernetics. Reflexive cybernetics should be able to identify how burdensome epistemological traps come to be and make discourse communities aware of their own involvement. Sometimes I think involvement is a softer way of saying complicity. And then, whenever conversations approximate genuineness, they invariably converge on a delicate balance between participants delegating their agency to other people, practices, and machines, and exercising their agency in mutual respect. I noticed that Kahan, Klaus's son, joined us here, and I just wanted to mention, I don't know if Kahan, if you remember, but my son, Doug, and you met in 1980, I believe it was, at Roger Conant's house and farm in Maine, and we met there. A large group met there to talk about the upcoming conference in 1981, the first one in 7 years there. And I remember that Kahan and Doug and all of us went to the beach one day. It was still foggy. I have some photos, I think, someplace, and they found some old pieces of wood and they put together a raft. And I was given Klaus's background in design and how he liked to build things. Thought it was quite appropriate. But thanks for being here, Kahan. That's it.
Larry, thanks. Larry, that's fantastic. I should also point out that Heike, Klaus's daughter, is also on the call. In addition,
oh, is she doing this? Oh, great.
Hi there.
Hi, Heike. I think you were there also at the at that meeting in Maine.
Don't remember that one. I was 6.
Yes. Okay.
Great.
Thank you.
That's great.